Now on BBC One, the news at 9 o'clock with Michael Burke.
NATO is set to authorise airstrikes against the Serbs within the hour. Diplomacy's failed, the missiles are ready, the Prime Minister and President Clinton say there's now no alternative. The Serbs are defiant, their offensive in Kosovo goes on, Kosovan villages burn. And the law catches up with the family who set up Britain's most successful fraud factory. Good evening. Within the next hour, NATO is expected to announce that its military commanders have been authorised to launch airstrikes against targets in Serbia and its province of Kosovo. Last-minute diplomacy appears to have failed. Both the Prime Minister and President Clinton have warned of serious consequences to come, but say there's no other way to avert a humanitarian disaster. Serbia remains defiant. Tonight, a state of emergency was declared across the entire country, and the people warned of imminent war. First, Bridget Kendall on the talks that failed and the road to war.
Who knows how long to go before airstrikes, but NATO allies in Belgrade are taking no chances tonight. The British Embassy was one of several that told its remaining employees to close the doors and start the evacuation. Arriving in Brussels this evening to brief NATO commanders on the failure of his mission, the US envoy Richard Holbrooke.
BBC, what are you going to tell the Secretary General of NATO? We'll tell you afterwards. We'll see you after the meetings.
Any time now, the NATO Secretary General is expected to announce the countdown to military action. Earlier in Belgrade, Mr. Holbrooke admitted to waiting journalists his 11th-hour talks with President Milosevic had got nowhere.
We've had other moments like this, but this one has a different character to it, and we must all recognize this. I think it's evident by the size of this crowd that all of you recognize it too. One last question.
And as he spoke, a defiant Serb parliament warned NATO it would defend its territory by any means possible. The Yugoslav government tonight has declared a state of emergency. It's cruise missiles from American warships and one British submarine in the Mediterranean that'll probably make the first strikes, targeting Yugoslavia's air defence installations. But strikes by manned aircraft, part of the fleet of 400 NATO planes on standby at bases in northern Italy, may follow soon afterwards. In London, Tony Blair, about to depart for a European summit in Berlin, prepared the nation this afternoon for possibly hazardous military action. No longer just to punish Belgrade for resisting a peace deal, he told Parliament it was to save Kosovo from a humanitarian disaster.
We must act to save thousands of innocent men, women and children from humanitarian catastrophe, from death, barbarism and ethnic cleansing by a brutal dictatorship, and to save the stability of the Balkan region.
So will the Prime Minister understand that while we would welcome an explicit demonstration of NATO credibility of the kind that he has announced and described, given the repeated threats of action, we regret that some decisive action did not take place earlier?
It was the Ratchak massacre in January that pushed NATO into making this latest threat of action. Over 40 Kosovo Albanians apparently killed by Serb police forces. That NATO threat helped bring both the Serbs and Albanians to the Rambouillet peace talks launched in early February by President Chirac. But a fortnight later, the talks broke up without agreement, giving President Milosevic time to build up his forces in Kosovo before the talks restarted. So when the Albanian delegation finally signed up to a peace deal on March the 18th, NATO faced 40,000 Serb and Yugoslav troops in and around Kosovo and a refugee crisis. So at the White House this afternoon, President Clinton summoned congressional leaders to seek their support for a military intervention he said Americans could no longer turn their backs on.
If President Milosevic is not willing to make peace, we are willing to limit his ability to make war on the Kosovars.
But the unknown is what military backlash might follow NATO airstrikes, and whether NATO peacekeepers just over the border from Kosovo in Macedonia, for instance, could find they become the new Serb targets. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
In Kosovo itself, Serb forces have stepped up their offensive, attacking villages and burning homes which they say are sheltering fighters of the Kosovo Liberation Army. The West says 25,000 people have been driven from their homes in the last few days. The most serious clashes today were in the area around the town of Podujevo and also in the Drenica region of central Kosovo. Ben Brown, who's there on a province in fear and the battleground for a new Balkan war.
When Serb troops come knocking at your door, you may not want to answer if you're an Albanian, but then again, you may not have much choice. Serbian security forces are now engaged in an all-out offensive to smash the Kosovo Liberation Army once and for all. Today, while President Milosevic has been talking, his troops have been fighting. They are taking territory from the rebels and rapidly advancing across Kosovo. At first, the Serbs tried to keep foreign journalists away. Today, though, they didn't bother to hide their offensive. It seems they are throwing down the gauntlet, almost challenging NATO to stop them. But for now, it is only the rebels of the Kosovo Liberation Army who are taking on the Serbs. We watched the KLA pouring in their very best troops this morning, the Black Tiger Commandos, to try and hold back the Serbian advance. Their guns, though, are no match for the tanks and heavy artillery of the Serbs, and they know it. The KLA rebels took me to their front line today. We came under heavy fire from the Serbs. One shell landed just a few hundred yards away. In the valley below, the rebels showed me the burning village of Poljac. To the Serbs, this was a terrorist stronghold. To the rebels, an ordinary village where women and children are in danger. According to the KLA, only NATO airstrikes can save Kosovo now. NATO have to attack, this rebel soldier told me, for the sake of our families, our women, children and old folk. There's no doubt the rebels of the Kosovo Liberation Army are being driven back by what is a sustained and systematic Serbian offensive. It is an onslaught that has gathered momentum ever since the international monitors who were here to observe the ceasefire left Kosovo over the weekend. And the result is another caravan of human misery in Kosovo, a bigger concentration of refugees on the roads here than at any time since the war started 1 year ago. Among those fleeing for their lives today, the very old and the very young. They're shelling and killing us, says this 14-year-old boy, and they've already burned our houses. And as the possibility of airstrikes grows closer, people are desperate to flee from Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. It's not just NATO's bombs they fear, it's the repercussions. Albanians believe that after airstrikes, they may become the targets for Serbian reprisals. This mother and baby were told there was no room for them on the bus, even though these days, Kosovo's just about the last place in Europe they want to be. Ben Brown, BBC News, Kosovo.
In Serbia, a country-wide state of emergency is enforced tonight. President Milosevic has told his people war is imminent. The BBC's John Simpson is in Belgrade. John, are the Serbs aware in detail of what's likely to happen to them? What are they being told?
Well, until this evening's declaration of a state of emergency, most people thought this was just another one of those crises which was going to go away. Since the last couple of hours, they've known that it isn't. The government's taking the most draconian powers. It can control what's left of the independent media, for instance. It can declare curfews. It can arrest people and so forth. And those are powers which are unprecedented for this country. So I think everybody is starting to sink into everybody how serious this now is. As for the independent foreign media who are here, we've been given extreme latitude so far. How our position will change, we don't yet know.
In as much as you're able to judge, John, are the people behind Milosevic in this confrontation?
I suppose reluctantly most of them are, not perhaps in Belgrade so much where there's much more opposition feeling, but in the country in general I imagine that's probably the case. And the fact is of course that when one's country is attacked by outside forces, it does tend to make people support, if not support the government, at least to come closer to it. So I suppose that probably is true, but I think it's with great reluctance.
Briefly, John, it may be NATO's strategy to try to drive a wedge between the Serbian people and their president. Is that likely?
Well, as I understand it, it is one of the basic NATO plans and proposals to be able to bring such pressure on President Milosevic that he'd actually be forced out of office, that he'd be overthrown by some figure or another in the political system or in the military system. The thought, though, of course, of the dislocation that would have to take place here before that would happen is quite considerable, and perhaps NATO will have a lot of problems in pushing that one through to the bitter end.
John Simpson in Belgrade, thanks very much. Here, the High Court in Belfast has tonight rejected the government's attempt to delay the early release of 4 IRA prisoners in Northern Ireland. It's thought the ruling could mean that 3 of the prisoners will be released from the maze tonight.
The High Court in Belfast sat late into the evening after hearing the Home Secretary's case against the early release of 4 IRA prisoners. Counsel for Jack Straw argued that the Sentence Review Commissioners who'd ordered the releases had, among other things, allowed themselves to be influenced by the Good Friday Agreement. But the judge, Mr. Justice Girvan, found against the Home Secretary's case on every ground on which it was based. He said there'd been no question of bad faith on the part of the Northern Ireland Sentence Review Commissioners, and he said their reasoning had not been shown to be legally flawed. One senior Sinn Féin member who was in court throughout said the party's view that the Home Secretary had a political agenda had been vindicated.
I think it's a good decision that the